During Argentina's economic collapse, kidnapping went from being something that's unheard of to becoming very common. If an economic collapse happens in the US in 2030, you can expect the exact same thing. Just look at how bad everything is now, and you can expect it to get much worse if an actual economic collapse happens. So the main driver of all the kidnappings that were happening in Argentina was to abduct people for money, because everyone was desperate for it. So cities were having up to 10 cases per day, and then after that, they completely had to stop reporting it because people were terrified. So it became really common because since the economy crashed, there were a lot of poor people who didn't have enough money to feed their families. Another reason was because the police were understaffed and overworked. So the first type would be professionals, where they would find someone who's walking or driving, and they would pull up with 2 vehicles, about 5 or 6 armed men with battle rifles and radios, and they would take the person. It was actually common to find police officers in these groups who were trying to supplement their meager salary. The victim is then taken to an extremely poor neighborhood or a remote location. Then they call the family asking for a ridiculously high ransom, and the negotiation starts there. So that's kind of how it is across the world. There's a guy who recently got kidnapped in Haiti. They started the ransom at $500,000, and then finally by the time he was released, they agreed on $40,000. So what was happening in Argentina is they would usually wait up to a month, and if the money didn't show up, they would end that person's life and go to the next person. They didn't want to waste any time. The person is usually beaten badly, and a lot of the times the person is gagged with like a cloth or something, and they end up choking on it and passing away. That's why I always say I'd rather fight and die there on first contact than get abducted and taken to another location. Sometimes they would take the person's finger, cut it off, and then send it to the family to encourage them to pay. In some cases, the victim is so terrified that they'll have some sort of heart or health complication and they'll pass away right there. And by the way, a lot of these kidnappings are arranged by friends or family who give info to the kidnappers for a percentage of the money. Can you imagine friends or relatives arranging to have you kidnapped for some money? The second kind of kidnapping was called an express kidnapping. The reason it's called express kidnapping is because it usually occurs fast, because the kidnappers ask for a really small amount of money and the victim is usually returned within 1 hour. Even the police were encouraging people to pay the ransom and get it over with. Generally, the kidnappers were looking for 2 things. One, someone who's dressed in expensive clothing and jewelry, and another is someone who looks weak or looks like they wouldn't put up a fight. So they were mostly going for women, children, and Nancy boys. And it goes without saying, women and children were usually the worst victim of all this. They were usually taken advantage of after they were abducted. The third kind was known as a virtual kidnapping. It's basically where you know someone is about to travel or is traveling, and as soon as they leave, you call their family and you tell them that that person's been abducted and you want money. In many cases, the call was fake, but they relied on the fact that the person is traveling and is probably on a plane and they won't be able to respond to any calls or text messages, so they relied on the fact that you can't confirm. There are many cases of people taking justice into their own hands during the Argentina economic collapse. I mentioned this on another platform, but they started following this new rule called SSS, which is shoot, shut up, and shovel. So if someone's breaking into their house or trying to do a home invasion or something like that, you grab your weapon, you take them out, you don't tell anyone, and you bury them somewhere far away. This was mostly done to avoid any legal issues in courts, and also the reason why people did this is because they didn't trust the police. They thought the police were corrupt, and they also believed that the police is more likely to take the criminal side than the actual victim. There's a case of a guy who escaped kidnappers multiple times. Twice he escaped from the actual van that they took him in. The first time he escaped was by throwing a grenade into the middle of the van. I believe it was a fake one, but they got scared, they crashed, and he escaped. The second time he threw a grenade and it ended up under the brake pedal, and they couldn't stop the vehicle, so they ended up crashing and he escaped. Another time someone broke into his home and he took them out with a .357 Magnum and he buried them somewhere. Alright guys, that's it for part 9 of surviving Argentina's economic collapse. I did it a little bit differently today because I felt I was able to summarize this a little bit better rather than just reading it off of paper. But I'll go back to the normal method in part 10. Make sure to like and subscribe.